coming to you live from Baku in Azerbaijan. My name is Tim Tongana. Hello and welcome to Daybreak right here on the A News channel. Let's see your headlines. The US launched airstrikes on dozens of targets in Iran in response to missile attacks on its forces. Russian missile strikes killed at least 7 people across Ukraine, prompting Poland to scramble fighter jets. Southern Europe is battling fresh wildfires, with 3 firefighters killed in Greece as extreme heat and strong winds fuel the blazes. The United States has resumed major military action against Iran after days of relative calm, as both sides exchange strikes that are rapidly widening the conflict. Iran says its attacks on U.S. targets in Jordan were retaliation for what it calls American aggression, raising fears of a broader regional war.
The United States has carried out fresh airstrikes inside Iran, hitting dozens of targets, with Washington casting the 2-hour strikes as a powerful response to Iranian missiles launched towards US forces in the Middle East a day earlier. Iran confirmed it had fired on US bases in Jordan. However, the missiles were intercepted, and President Donald Trump said the US would respond strongly.
They know it's coming. They're asking us not to do it, but they tried shooting it last night. So we had 5 rockets shot going 8,500 miles an hour, and all 5 rockets were knocked down to the ground. But they nevertheless took a shot, so it's our turn. And we'll see if we get there with an agreement at some point, but we're going to hit them very hard.
Iranian state television released footage from Geshem Island showing rescue teams clearing rubble from a residential building after the strikes. The US action followed Trump's earlier pledge to retaliate. Meanwhile, a drone struck the US-owned gas storage tanker Energos Winter at Egypt's Damietta port, causing a fire that spread to another vessel. Maritime security firms and trading sources said the blast was likely caused by a drone strike. No group has claimed responsibility. In Iraq, Prime Minister Ali al-Zaidi chaired an emergency National Security Council meeting after joint US-Saudi strikes targeted Iran-backed paramilitary groups. His office condemned the attacks and announced a new security plan to protect Iraq's sovereignty and prevent threats to neighboring countries. Iraq's Popular Mobilization Forces said at least 20 fighters were killed and 32 wounded. Washington and Riyadh said those strikes were retaliation for drone attacks on Saudi oil facilities launched from Iraq. Axios also reported that Trump met Saudi Defense Minister Prince Khalid bin Salman, who urged efforts to reduce tensions.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has met with U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth in Washington following talks with President Donald Trump at the White House. The meeting came during Netanyahu's visit to the U.S. Capitol, where he also held talks with President Donald Trump at the White House. The discussions took place amid ongoing tensions over Iran. Now to energy markets. Oil prices have jumped sharply after fresh military action in the Middle East, adding to uncertainty over regional stability.
Oil prices rose by more than 3% after joint US-Saudi strikes in Iraq and the interception of ballistic missiles aimed at US forces. Brent crude climbed nearly $3 a barrel, while US benchmark West Texas Intermediate also gained more than 3%. The rise follows the attacks by the US and Saudi Arabia on Iran-backed groups in Iraq, blaming them for drone attacks on Saudi oil facilities. However, Iran warned that blaming it for the drone attacks on Saudi oil facilities would be a major miscalculation. The strikes came hours after the US military said it had averted what it described as a surprise Iranian attack on US troops in the region. Analysts at ING said the latest developments had dampened expectations for a swift de-escalation in the Gulf. The focus is on the Strait of Hormuz, where shipping remains subdued, with just 5 commodity ships passing through the waterway on Tuesday. Diplomatic efforts have also suffered a setback. Reuters reports Tehran has rejected an Omani proposal, backed by Gulf states for joint management of the strait, reducing the chances of an agreement. Prices were also supported by industry data showing US crude inventories fell by about 3.3 million barrels last week, ahead of official figures due later on Wednesday. Analysts at DBS Bank expect Brent to remain volatile, trading between $80 and $100 a barrel in the near term as the conflict ebbs and flows, while Reuters sources say OPEC Plus is likely to pause planned oil output increases for 3 months from October.
As you know, here on A News, we're covering and closely watching those developments between the US and Iran. To talk more about this top story, I'm joined by political analyst Fuad Karimli in studio. Thank you so much for joining us and making the time for A News.
Thank you for having me.
So we know that Saudi Arabia has already formed a part of this conflict between the US and Iran. So what strategically is new about this new joint operation? And do you think it is significant given the fact that now Saudi has publicly shown its involvement?
Well, up until now, we saw that Saudi Arabia's involvement in the war between Iran and the US has been more passive, in the sense that they have been attacked numerous times by Iran, the oil facilities, strategic military targets as well. But up until now, we see that countries in the Middle East, except Iran obviously, have shown that they do not want to be involved in the conflict and they want it to be de-escalated. But now we see that Saudi Arabia being directly involved in the military operations against Iran, it shows that they are entering a new phase. They are taking a more reactive and offensive stance as opposed to being more defensive and looking for diplomatic solutions.
So with this latest incident taking place, is it limited to self-defense following the attacks on Saudi's facilities?
We see that the strikes in Iraq, it also shows that it's a bit more than just self-defense. It's a strategy by the US and Saudi to kind of push back Iran. But to what extent this will work, to what extent this will have an effect, only time will show. We see that up until now, at least, Iran has been more instigated by these attacks rather than pacified.
So Iraq has basically condemned these attacks by the US and Saudi and says it's a violation of sovereignty, its sovereignty to be specific. Yet the Iran-backed militias operate with significant political military influence inside the country. Is Iraq becoming an unwilling battleground for a proxy war that it cannot control?
In terms of unwillingness, it's kind of difficult to say. Iraq is an interesting case where the majority of the population is Shia Muslim. So the influence of Iran and its network is quite significant. We saw this specifically after the Iraq War back in the early 2000s, that Iran was able to penetrate the political and even the economic system of Iraq and sway the decision-making procedures in certain directions. And we see that now Iraq is kind of conflicted in the sense that it is still aligned with the US while also trying to balance itself with Iran as well, as there is a Shia majority in the country. A lot of decision makers themselves are backing Iran. So I think in the end, it's this difficult situation that Iraq finds itself in.
Mm-hmm. So we know that the United States says the strikes were retaliation, right? With President Trump, who continues to speak about pursuing peace with Tehran. I mean, we know there was a pause recently. He seemed to want to take a more diplomatic approach. Can Washington credibly pursue diplomacy while expanding military action across Iran, Iraq, and the wider region? Or are these approaches now working against each other because we now see there's been fresh strikes?
When we put together those two concepts of military attacks and diplomacy, at first it seems kind of paradoxical. And In this case, it certainly does, because whenever the diplomatic talks begin, that's when the military strikes have usually stopped, and vice versa. So we see that the US is in a really difficult situation right now. The midterm elections are coming up in November. Trump really, whatever the case is, really, I think, believes that he needs to finish this war as soon as possible, because up until the elections, he needs to gain back those votes. As we saw, Brent crude oil prices are increasing. It's past $80 already. So this is all really problematic for US domestic politics as well. But when we look at it in the sense of diplomacy, we saw that up until last weekend, there were already strikes that were going on for 2 weeks. And the strategy of the US is always that we'll have limited strikes, it'll be very effective, and then we'll basically bow them to our will. But we see that Iran has usually, up until now, has been more retaliatory rather than being pacified.
Now, it's interesting that you mention domestic issues within the U.S. with an upcoming election for Donald Trump. He met with the Prime Minister of Israel. I want to bring him into this discussion because Israel is also another country that has been having talks with President Trump about Iran. And do you think then that meeting that took place between Benjamin Netanyahu and Trump, do you think they somewhat discussed a way forward with back in mind of what they are facing in terms of elections respectively, because Benjamin Netanyahu is also facing an election later this year?
Yeah. Well, we see that the US and Israeli policies in terms of Iran have been increasingly divergent. Israel, as it sees Iran as an existential threat to its basically existence in the region, Israel really does want a regime change. And while we may think that the US also started with that idea as well, with that rhetoric in mind, we saw that in the past few months, President Donald Trump has really been pushing for talks and diplomacy as well, while these escalations have been happening. So he doesn't let the strikes not be retaliated, but he also pushes for talks. But we see that from the Israeli side, it's always been in their sense, total regime change. That is their aim, rather than pacifying the situation and ending the conflict.
Okay, now with attacks and threats now affecting the Strait of Hormuz, the Red Sea and energy infrastructure, are we now beginning to witness a deliberate strategy to turn global energy routes into pressure points? And how vulnerable is the world economy if these maritime choke points remain unstable?
Well, we saw that since the beginning of this conflict, Iran's strategy was to usually use those maritime strategic points to put pressure on the US, but not just the US, but the whole global oil market, because we know that a lot of the Middle Eastern countries are really dependent on oil revenues. So this was a shock since the beginning of the conflict on all of the oil producing and exporting countries, specifically the Gulf countries. And we see that Iran, this is Iran's, ironically, their trump card. This is what they use to put pressure, the most pressure on the US and the world and its allies in the region as well. So they're just going to keep using this. There are discussions on, there was a suggestion on having a joint control between US and Iran of the Strait of Hormuz, which they declined. Iran declined this. So we see that Iran is quite aware of the fact that this is their biggest and strongest, per se, weapon against the US and its allies. So it's really holding on tight to it and using this as a really big bargaining chip.
Okay, so you mentioned that President Trump is under pressure to somewhat quickly wrap up this war. Oil prices have surged sharply, while concerns are growing about the strain on US missile defenses. So Trump is faced with pressure within, domestic pressure with the upcoming elections. And we also know that there's growing strain with US self-defense and munitions stockpiles. Could the greatest pressure eventually come not exactly from Iran's military response, but from economic and strategic cost of sustaining this war, which he wants to quickly wrap up?
We see that the war between US and Iran, it's transforming into more of a war of attrition. So basically that's a war where both sides see which side can endure the most and which side can hold out the most. And we see that obviously Iran is sustaining a lot of damage into its infrastructure, into its military capabilities, a lot of loss of civilian lives as well. But on the US side, we see that specifically in the recent months, there's a lot of disagreement on the amount of money that should be spent on defense, a lot of disagreements between Congress and the Department of War. So yes, it is becoming who's going to endure it the most kind of conflict.
All right, Mr. Karimli, thank you so much for joining us on A News. You're always making time. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Now to a short break. When I return, I'll discuss the rest of the global stories. Stay tuned. Welcome back. You're watching Daybreak. Now let's have a look at those global stories. Ukraine and Russia have exchanged another wave of attacks, with strikes reported on both sides. Officials say the latest escalation caused casualties and damage to civilian and industrial sites.
Russian missile strikes across Ukraine have killed at least 7 people, including 1 in Kiev and 6 in Kryvyi Rih, as Moscow launched another wave of attacks nationwide. That's according to Ukrainian officials on Thursday. The mayor said the capital was targeted with ballistic missiles, with fires reported in several districts. Authorities said emergency crews responded to damage caused by falling debris across the city. As air raid alerts sounded, many Kyiv residents sought shelter in underground metro stations, which were opened as temporary shelters during the attack. In the western city of Lviv, Russian airstrikes injured at least a dozen people. That's according to Mayor Andriy Sadovyi, who says people remain trapped under rubble of a residential building. The strikes followed a warning from President Volodymyr Zelensky that Russia was preparing a major attack, urging Ukrainians to remain alert during air raid warnings. Meanwhile, Ukrainian officials said its forces carried out overnight drone strikes on targets inside Russia, including oil refineries and logistics facilities. Russian authorities reported damage in several regions. A warehouse belonging to online retailer Wildfires in Penza caught fire after a Ukrainian drone attack. That's according to regional governor Oleg Melnichenko. 1 person was injured and around 200 people were evacuated to safety. Russian officials also reported drone strikes in Ryazan, Perm, Taganrog and Crimea, with casualties and damage reported in some areas. Russia's defense ministry said its forces struck 2 vessels carrying military supplies near the Ukrainian port city of Odessa. The latest attacks come as both sides continue targeting infrastructure and military-related sites. Both Russia and Ukraine deny deliberately targeting civilians.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky met with the Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk in Lublin on Wednesday to discuss defense, security and bilateral ties. Zelensky said the talks focused on air defense cooperation and the outcome of his Washington visit, while also addressing historical issues and Ukrainian refugees in Poland. Meanwhile, Poland said it scrambled fighter jets and activated its air defense as Russian strikes targeted Lviv in Ukraine, calling measures preventative. Tusk reaffirmed support for Kyiv and regional security. Former Ukrainian Defense Minister Mikhail Fedorov says opposition to his military procurement reforms was behind his dismissal earlier this month. In an interview with the former defense minister said his defense procurement reforms face resistance from officials and affected groups. He said he aimed to reform the system, not target individuals, but face growing pressure. Removed after 6 months as defense minister, he denied personal conflict with Ukraine's military leadership, calling their differences disagreements over approach. One of the world's most popular messaging apps, Telegram, is again facing legal scrutiny a day after Russia announced criminal charges against its founder, Pavel Durov, in Australia. We know that they've also now launched a court action against the platform.
Australia has become the latest country to take legal action against Telegram, accusing the messaging platform of failing to remove terrorist content. The country's online safety regulator launched proceedings on Thursday, alleging it failed to take down videos of terrorist executions and mass shootings, despite being notified about the material. If the court rules against the company, Telegram could face penalties of up to 54.6 million Australian dollars.
This case concerns content linked to some of the most notorious acts of known extremist violence in recent history, including depicting the Christchurch and Buffalo attacks, as well as ISIS beheadings and executions, and other horrific material used for propaganda and for radicalization. We allege that this content remained publicly accessible on the service long after Telegram had been put on notice by user reports.
The case adds to growing international scrutiny of Telegram and its founder, Pavel Durov. On Wednesday, Russia's Federal Security Service, the FSB, announced criminal charges against Durov, accusing him of facilitating terrorist activity by failing to remove content allegedly used by Ukrainian intelligence agencies, as well as terrorist and extremist groups, to coordinate sabotage, attacks, mass killings, and cyber fraud inside Russia. The FSB says it has also issued an international arrest warrant for Durov. Telegram has not publicly commented on the latest allegations. Durov, who was born in Russia and now holds French and Emirati citizenship, left Russia in 2014 after resisting pressure from Russian authorities over user data. He later relocated Telegram's headquarters to Dubai. He also remains under investigation in France over allegations that Telegram failed to adequately tackle criminal activity on the platform and did not sufficiently cooperate with law enforcement requests. Durov denies any wrongdoing.
UK Prime Minister Andy Burnham has unveiled plans to reform England's social care system, calling it one of the country's biggest domestic challenges. He says his government is determined to succeed where previous administrations have failed. Zainab for A News reports.
Prime Minister Andy Burnham has launched what he calls a once-in-a-generation effort to reform England's social care system, saying there have been 22 failed attempts at reform over the past 3 decades and that the country cannot afford another one. Speaking after cross-party talks in London, Burnham drew on his own family's experience after his father was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. He said the current system is failing elderly and vulnerable people while placing too much responsibility on families. Promising better pay, training and career opportunities, he said carers should become the best paid people in society, not the worst. The Prime Minister wants to create a national care service, bringing social care closer to the NHS and improving coordination between hospitals, community services and home care. The government says that reforms are intended to reduce pressure on hospitals and end what Burnham calls a postcode lottery in access to care. But key questions remain over how the plans would be funded. Burnham acknowledged there would be difficult decisions ahead, while insisting Labour would keep its manifesto pledge not to raise income tax, VAT or national insurance. The proposals have already divided politicians. Reform UK criticised being excluded from the talks, while the Conservatives questioned how the government would pay for the reforms. For now, today's announcement marks the start of a long-term reform programme. The government will hold further cross-party talks and launch a nationwide public consultation before bringing forward detailed proposals for a new national care service. Zainab Farizadeh, A News, Manchester, United Kingdom.
US President Donald Trump says Britain's new Prime Minister Andy Burnham told him he plans to open up the North Sea oil development, a move that would represent a shift in the UK's energy policy. Last week, it was reported that Burnham is expected to move quickly to escalate and scale up oil and gas production as part of a wider push to tackle the cost of living. Trump made the comment during a White House briefing on Wednesday after speaking to UK's Prime Minister on Monday.
Well, he did say one very good thing. He said he's going to open up North Sea oil. If he does that, you're going to be a wealthy country. If he does it reasonably. I was telling Prime Minister Starmer, open up the North Sea. Open it up. You'll be okay. Open it up. If you use the North Sea, the UK will be a really rich country. I cannot get the point across. The new gentleman, when I spoke to him, he said he's going to open up the North Sea. Let's see if that's...
US President Donald Trump says he wants the power to impose tariffs on Iran, added to Russia's sanctions legislation backed by the late Senator Lindsey Graham. Trump says additional tariffs would increase pressure on Tehran.
So I'd like them to add Iran as tariffs, not just as sanctions. I think it's important. That's what Lindsey wanted, because I heard that they have tariffs on Russia, but not on those 5 countries with having to do with Iran. I'd like to see tariffs on Iran. It would make it much stronger. So perhaps you're very good at this. You can maybe tell them. I think they should put in for Russia, but I think they should put in for Iran. And that's really what Lindsey wanted. Yep.
All right, Southern Europe is facing another heat wave of devastating wildfires with soaring temperatures and strong winds stretching emergency services across several countries. Greece, France, and Spain have all reported major blazes, forcing mass evacuations and prompting fresh warnings from European authorities.
3 firefighters have died while battling a wildfire on the Greek island of Crete as extreme heat and strong winds fuel blazes across southern Europe. The firefighters became trapped while traveling between fire fronts in the Rethymno region. The blaze spread rapidly, forcing residents of 3 nearby villages to evacuate. European emergency officials have warned that Greece and Italy could face a heightened wildfire risk in the coming weeks. In southwestern France, firefighters kept a major blaze west of Bordeaux stable overnight, but rising temperatures and stronger winds raised fears of further flare-ups. Around 220,000 people have been evacuated from the region, where fires have devastated 42,000 hectares of mainly pine forest. Some residents have returned to find their homes destroyed.
Like the region I've been born and raised into, basically go up into flames. And I mean, we've known for a long time that you have fires. It happens like almost every 2 years, something like that, but something that big.
In Spain, a major fire between Avila and Madrid has stabilized, allowing some evacuation and shelter orders to be lifted. But another blaze in Zamora forced 6 towns to evacuate, while around 1,000 people were told to remain indoors. In Castellón, a fire remained out of control after burning more than 10,000 hectares, leaving around 10,000 residents unable to return home. The fires have also destroyed forests and killed wildlife, as heat, drought, and strong winds continue to worsen conditions across the continent.
Firefighters are responding to a fast-spreading wildfire in Canada's British Columbia, with aircraft and ground crews deployed to contain the blaze. Around 24 firefighters supported by air tankers, skimmers, helicopters, and Logan Lake volunteer firefighters are battling the fire in Kyrgyzstan, Greek. The latest blaze adds to a summer of wildfires fueled by intense heat and lightning linked to warmer temperatures burning across Canada's remote forests. Over to Japan, where the death toll has risen to 28 after a powerful 7.1 magnitude earthquake struck Japan's Kumamoto prefecture. New aerial footage now reveals the scale of the destruction and the ongoing rescue efforts across the affected area.
The damage caused by a 7.1 magnitude earthquake in Japan's Kumamoto prefecture is visible in new aerial footage. Railway tracks have buckled and several rail bridges have been damaged. The earthquake destroyed roads and cut power to thousands of homes. The epicenter was about 20 kilometers south of Kumamoto city. The Kumamoto prefectural government says the death toll has risen to 28. Most of the victims were killed at the Nippon Paper Industries paper mill and the Aeon shopping centre.
According to police reports, 9 people have so far been rescued at Aeon Mall, Kumamoto. Of those, 5 have died and authorities are still investigating the link to the disaster. Also, as of 6:30 a.m. local time today, 10 people have been rescued so far at the Nippon Paper Yatsushiro mill. Of those, 5 have died and the connection to the disaster is also under investigation.
Rescue workers, police and military personnel continue searching for people trapped under the rubble. More than 4,500 troops have been deployed to support recovery efforts across the affected area. Authorities have advised about 260,000 residents to go to evacuation centres. Police say they received 386 emergency calls after the earthquake. More than 100 aftershocks have been recorded across the region since the main quake struck Tuesday morning.
Now to a quick break. When we return, I'll discuss the key regional headlines and I'll be joined by a guest to dig deeper into some of those stories. Stay tuned. Russian refinery disruptions are squeezing Kyrgyzstan's fuel supplies, forcing Bishkek to secure alternative imports as prices surge. A News's Fariza has more.
Kyrgyzstan is seeking fresh fuel supplies from Russia as disruptions at Russian oil refineries continue to reduce exports. A government delegation is in Moscow negotiating monthly deliveries of 100,000 tons of petroleum products at market prices, according to First Deputy Prime Minister Daniyar Mangaldiv. The talks follow Ukrainian drone strikes that forced production cuts at several Russian refineries, limiting fuel available for export. The impact is significant for Kyrgyzstan, which imports more than 90% of its petrol from Russia. To reduce its dependence, Bishkek has signed contracts for diesel and aviation fuel from Belarus and China and is seeking additional supplies from neighboring countries. At home, the government has imposed an indefinite ban on petroleum product exports to safeguard domestic supplies through the end of the year. Officials also face rising import costs. Mangaldiv says petrol prices have jumped from about $860 to as much as $1,400 per ton under some recent contracts, driven by supply shortages and geopolitical tensions. And to ease the burden, the government has introduced the state-funded compensation scheme for suppliers of EI-92 petrol and diesel, while EI-95 will continue to be sold at market prices. Fariza Kalimurzina, Almaty, A News.
As Ukraine's drone campaign continues to target Russia's energy infrastructure, questions are increasingly going up, not only about Moscow's domestic fuel supplies, but also about its ability to honor contractual export commitments. Kyrgyzstan, which imports around 90% of its gasoline from Russia, is said to be in talks with Moscow over fuel supplies amidst shortages. The developments come against the backdrop of growing questions over the resilience of Russia's energy logistics and the implications of its regional partners. Now, to talk more on the story, I'm joined to discuss this story by Dmitry Bridzia, who's a political analyst. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us on A News.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
So how severe is the exposure for Kyrgyzstan, which imports over 90% of its gasoline directly from Russia, which remains vulnerable in refined petroleum products, given the global crude availability is irrelevant when regional refining capacity collapses?
In my opinion, even though Russian oil refineries are attacked by Ukraine since the beginning of this year, and even though there is sanctions implemented on Russian economy and on oil and gas companies like Gazprom, Lukoil, Rosneft, Russia is trying to find new markets and is trying to cooperate more with Central Asian countries, with Asian countries. And of course, the negotiations between Kyrgyzstan and Russia over additional fuel supplies should not be viewed as isolated bilateral issue, rather than reflect growing independence of Eurasian energy market and more dependence on Russia, and the vulnerability of regional supply chains when disruptions occur in a major exporting country. As we know, as you said, Kyrgyzstan imports more than 90% of gasoline from Russia. And as we know, such a high degree of dependence means that any disruption in Russian refining logistics or export policy is quickly transmitted to the Kyrgyzstan or Kyrgyz market. And what we are witnessing today is therefore not simply a domestic fuel shortage in Kyrgyzstan, but a regional supply chain challenge affecting several Central Asian economies. And of course, it's related to the Ukrainian crisis and related to the situation between Russia and Ukraine. And of course, because of the sanctions that are implemented by the European Union and the United States of America because of the Russian-Ukrainian war. And from Russian perspective, this priority remains stabilizing the domestic fuel market after the attacks by drones from the Ukrainian side and the sanctions and recent disruption to refinery operations, together with seasonal demand and logistic issues, have forced Moscow to find other exports ways to different countries and to find other partners than the European partners that were in the past were the main buyers of the oil and gas from Russia.
All right, now with Ukrainian deep strikes destabilizing up to a third of Russia's refining capacity and then prompting Moscow to then impose unilateral fuel export restrictions, how vulnerable has Russia become then to disruptions that could force it to override or delay its contractual commitments within Eurasian Economic Union?
I think Russia is trying to find a solution. Today, the massive attack of drones on the Russian supplies and Russian ports, like in Novorossiysk or in the south of Russia, is of course affecting the economy of Russian Federation. But Russia is trying to find a solution for that and trying to more cooperate, because today, if Russia won't export its oil products, the Russian economy could face huge difficulties because of the problems of transportation and logistics. But I think that the Russian government is trying to find a solution for that, because if Russia won't find a solution, the Russian economy will face huge pressure. As we know, as I said, that also Russian economy facing huge pressure because of the sanctions and because of restrictions from the European Union and the United States of America, that's also making pressure on the Central Asian countries' companies to cooperate with Russia, even with the Asian companies that also cooperated with Russia and also facing difficulties because of restrictions and because some companies even entered the sanctions list. So today, of course, for the Russia, it's the priority to find a solution for the problem of exporting its products, especially oil products, to different companies, because nowadays also big corporations like Lukoil, Gazprom, Rosneft, and Tatneft are facing also difficulties in order to find solution for the market and finding solution for their products.
Yeah, that's interesting, Mr. Dmitry. The recent attack facing the Caspian Pipeline Consortium's infrastructure also raises concern about Kazakhstan's oil export capabilities. The consortium is only partly Russian-owned. How significant was the incident, and could it have longer implication for Kazakhstan's energy exports and for confidence in regional energy transit routes and Russia's reliability?
Of course, the attacks on Caspian Sea, on the tankers in Caspian Sea, is affecting the stability of Caspian Sea today. And because Ukraine is trying to make more pressure on Russia, not only in the Caspian Sea, but also in the Middle East, when the Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky blamed Russia that Russia is supporting Iran its war against the United States of America, and is giving intelligence information about targets that related to the U.S. interest in the Middle East, in the Gulf region. So, of course, today, Ukraine is trying to also make pressures on all partners that are cooperating with Russian Federation. It could be if you're talking about Kazakhstan or Kyrgyzstan or Tajikistan or Uzbekistan and other countries that are also cooperating with Russia. So, and the incidents in the Caspian Sea shows that the Ukrainian crisis is becoming more problematic for all the countries of post-Soviet Union countries nowadays, if one won't find a solution, a proper solution, diplomatic solution on diplomatic level, both in the European Union and Ukraine and Russia, in order to have a peace agreement. So, of course, now the situation in Caspian Sea also could make alerts for big companies that working in the oil industry that this region is not that stable anymore as it was in the past because of the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, and that they should push more forward, finding other ways and other routes that could be used for the oil supply, because there are more tensions from the international intelligence community that this region also could be destabilized because of the Russian-Ukrainian crisis.
Kyrgyzstan, a member of the Organization of Turkic States, is said to be seeking to diversify its fuel supplies through agreements with Belarus and China. How effective are these alternatives, Mr. Dmitry, and how likely are they to be? Can they realistically compensate for any sustained disruption of supplies from Russia?
I think that we could be alternatives. If you're talking about Azerbaijan, if you're talking about Kazakhstan, other countries that are also competing nowadays. In the past, if you're talking about these countries, they were part of kind of one organization. Today, there is kind of also competition between these countries. So, of course, it could affect the big companies, Russian companies like Lukoil, Rosneft, Tatneft, and other companies that are working in oil industry. And this competition is because Russia are facing huge pressure nowadays, and especially the logistics, the trade routes from Russia to other countries. We're talking about Central Asian countries, we're talking about Asian countries, or to even European Union because of course, of the sanctions and restrictions to oil from Russian side. So, of course, it will be beneficial from the for the alternative countries like Azerbaijan or Kazakhstan or other countries that also working in oil industry, and it will be beneficial from them. But I think, as I said, Russian government will try to find a solution for the situation, and it could be more on diplomatic level or finding other trade routes that could be useful for the Russian companies that are cooperating with Asian countries, Central Asian countries, and other countries that are buying oil products from the Russian side, and they are cooperating with Russia.
Mr. Dmitry, we really do appreciate your insights here on Daybreak on A News. Thank you so much for your time.
You're
Kazakhstan's Foreign Minister Yermak Kusherbayev has discussed the Caspian Pipeline Consortium with U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio. It's after recent disruption to oil exports. The phone call came after the pipeline's Black Sea terminal resumed operations this week, ending a week-long suspension caused by Ukrainian drone attacks. Turkey has mobilized thousands of personnel and aircraft as wildfires spread across western and southern provinces. President Tayyip says most of Wednesday's outbreaks have been brought under control, but major operations are still continuing.
Firefighters are battling multiple wildfires across western and southern Turkey, with evacuations underway as strong winds push flames towards residential and tourist areas. The largest operation is in Muğla's Seydi Kemer district, where more than 600 people were evacuated from around 300 homes across 6 neighborhoods. Patients were transferred from the local hospital as a precaution, while no deaths were reported. In Antalya, 10 of 12 fires recorded over 2 days were extinguished. Operations continued in Kaş and Kumluca, where residents were evacuated as flames threatened nearby homes. 3 forestry workers suffered minor injuries. Around 650 people were also evacuated from 210 homes in Balıkesir's Edremit district as flames advanced towards Altınoluk. President Erdogan outlined the scale of the emergency after a cabinet meeting in Ankara on Wednesday.
Ülkemiz genelinde 59'u orman dışı olan alan.
Today, a total of 90 fires have broken out across our country so far. 59 of them in areas outside forests. 81 of these fires have been brought fully under control. Our efforts to contain the fires in Muğla, Balıkesir, Antalya and Çanakkale are continuing.
Çanakkale'deki yangınların kontrol altına alınmasına yönelik çalışmalarımız devam ediyor.
Erdogan said more than 3,200 personnel, supported by 21 aircraft, 58 helicopters and hundreds of ground vehicles, were working to contain the remaining fires. The Agriculture and Forestry Ministry said aerial and ground operations were continuing at the remaining active fronts, while some other fires had been contained or had lost intensity.
Turkey is moving toward a new legal process following the PKK's decision to disarm and dissolve. President Recep Tayyip Erdogan says legislation related to the move will be submitted to Parliament in the coming days.
When the obstacle of terrorism is removed, Turkey's economy will begin to write a new story in every field. We believe this with all our hearts. In the coming days, we will submit to the opinion of our veteran parliament the legal regulation that we have been working on for some time. As the People's Alliance, despite various difficulties, we will, God willing, bring this important process, which we have carried out in full solidarity, to its goal with the support of our political parties that place national issues above their personal interest.
siyasi partilerimizin de desteğiyle inşallah hedefine.
The Caucasus Mountains are providing a spectacular stage for world-class performers and emerging talent at the 15th Gabala International Music Festival. Dilek Tuna for A News was there and sent us this report.
Hello from Gabala. Over the next few days, this beautiful mountain town will once again become the cultural heart of Azerbaijan as it hosts the 15th Gabala International Music Festival. Now, this isn't just about classical music. This year's festival brings together performers from Azerbaijan and several other countries with a program that includes orchestral concerts, traditional music, dance, performances, and for the first time, a wider celebration of art and culture with exhibitions, craft fairs and creative activities. The opening ceremony was underway on Wednesday evening, and throughout the festival, audiences will be treated to performances by internationally recognised musicians alongside emerging young talent, all set against the stunning backdrop of the Caucasus Mountains. Over the next 2 days, we'll be taking you behind the scenes, speaking with performers and organisers and bringing you the atmosphere from one of Azerbaijan's best-known international cultural events. From Gabala, Dilek Tuna and Natik Mehmedov for A News.
And that's it from me and the Daybreak team. Thank you so much for joining us. See you next time.